I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy.
You can find previous podcasts and more information on a range of health topics at peoplespharmacy.com. Do you ever have trouble falling asleep? Or do you wake up in the middle of the night and have trouble getting back to sleep? This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
Some people have trouble winding down after a busy day. They may review conversations and think of what they should have said instead. Is there a good way to turn off the noise inside your head?
Do you worry when you can't get enough sleep? Sometimes that becomes a vicious insomnia cycle.
What's the latest on snoring? Should it be treated? If so, what works best?
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, science-based solutions for sleeping through the night.
In the People's Pharmacy Health Headlines, new data reveal that the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are not as effective against the Delta variant of SARS-CoV-2 as scientists had hoped. Researchers at the Mayo Clinic compared the effectiveness of both vaccines from January to July 2021. During the early part of that period, the Alpha variant predominated, but by July, the Delta variant had taken over. The study found that the Pfizer vaccine was only 42% effective against infection with the Delta variant in July. Moderna fared better. It was 76% effective. The researchers report that people vaccinated with the Moderna vaccine were about half as likely to experience breakthrough infections as individuals vaccinated with the Pfizer-BioNTech shot. The good news remains that people who have been vaccinated are less likely to develop severe infections that require hospitalizations. The bad news is that more breakthrough infections are likely to occur over the next several weeks. Prudent people will continue to take additional precautions against exposure.
The importance of a healthy gut ecosystem has become increasingly clear over the past decade. Diet has a major effect on our digestive microbes, but most studies have focused on the effects of just one or two foods rather than the diet overall. Now, Finnish scientists report on the results of an analysis of nearly 5,000 adults who participated in the FinRisk 2002 study. At that time, volunteers responded to detailed diet questionnaires, and the scientists ranked their diets on a healthy food choices score. Those with the highest healthy food choices score had the most diverse microbiota. Fiber-rich breads, poultry, fruits, and low-fat cheeses were most closely associated with microbial diversity. Vegetables, berries, and fruits were associated with greater variety in the microbial diversity. In addition, the microbes from people making healthy food choices also produced more short-chain fatty acids that are beneficial to human health.
If you have high blood pressure that doesn't respond well to medication, what can you do? Scientists in Portugal now recommend regular aerobic exercise. They invited 60 patients with resistant hypertension to participate in a 3-month study. Half of the volunteers got 3 supervised aerobic training sessions each week, along with their usual medical care. The other half had only usual care. Volunteers who exercised had an 8-point drop in their systolic blood pressure and more than 5 points down in their diastolic pressure.
Sunscreens have come under increasing scrutiny ever since FDA research revealed that ingredients in these skin creams can be absorbed into the body. Several months ago, there were reports of benzene contamination in some sunscreen products. Johnson & Johnson recalled 5 lots of Neutrogena and Aveeno aerosol sunscreen product lines because of concerns about benzene levels. Now, an independent laboratory has identified benzophenone, a potential carcinogen, in several sunscreens that are made with octocrylene. The researchers have asked the FDA to remove from sale all products made with this ingredient. They worry that benzophenone may be a hormone disruptor.
Nutrition experts express the importance of eating plenty of unprocessed foods such as vegetables, fruits, legumes, and whole grains. A new study shows, however, that young Americans get 2/3 of their calories from ultra-processed foods. That proportion has increased substantially over the last 20 years. The data analyzed come from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey of almost 34,000 children and teens between 1999 and 2018. Most ultra-processed foods have less fiber and more sugar and salt than their unprocessed counterparts. Examples include breakfast cereal, French fries, and fast food burgers. Ready-to-eat and ready-to-heat foods accounted for the greatest increase in calories from processed foods. The researchers note that increasing consumption of ultra-processed foods makes it easy for young people to get too many calories and probably contributes to childhood obesity. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Have you been having trouble sleeping lately? A lot of people do. Sleep difficulties are one of the most common complaints people have about their health. Some have trouble turning off the monologue in their minds. Others wake up too early and can't fall back asleep. Teenagers are especially vulnerable to sleep debt. They often end up burning the candle at both ends. What are the consequences of too little sleep over time? Today, we're talking about science-based solutions for insomnia.
Dr. Rafael Pelayo is a clinical professor at Stanford University School of Medicine in the Division of Sleep Medicine. Since 1993, he's been part of the Stanford Sleep Medicine Clinic. He served on advisory boards and in leadership positions for the National Center on Sleep Disorders Research at the NIH, the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, the National Sleep Foundation, and the California Sleep Society. Dr. Pelayo is the author of How to Sleep, the new science-based solutions for sleeping through the night.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Rafael Pelayo.
Thank you, Joe and Terry. Thank you so much for having me on the show. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to your listeners.
Well, I'm thrilled with the opportunity to talk to you, Dr. Pelayo. I've been interested in sleep research. You're going to have a hard time believing this. Since the mid-1960s, when I was an undergraduate, I attended a lecture by Dr. William Dement about the different stages of sleep, and I was hooked immediately. How did you get interested in this field of research?
Dr. William Dement was one of my best friends. Sadly, he passed away last year, and I miss him a lot. And I got to work with him a lot at Stanford. I was curious about sleep as a teenager. I want to know why we sleep. It seems like such a bizarre thing to do. I want to know whether animals dream, what's happening in that. I had a lucid dreaming experience as a teenager that made me curious about what's the function of sleep anyway. So that's my journey began a simple curiosity about it. When I got to medical school, the first week I was there, somebody mentioned that there was a sleep lab. So I visited the sleep lab, and that's when I found out that there was such a thing as sleep medicine. And from that day forward, I focused my career path on becoming a sleep expert, sleep physician, and I was very grateful to get a chance to work with Dr. Dement at Stanford.
Dr. Pelayo, you mentioned that you have had a lucid dreaming experience when you were a teenager. Could you explain to us what is lucid dreaming and what was your experience like?
Just in general, was the experience of I was in a dream and realized, wait, am I a dream? If this is really a dream, so can I really do this? And I was startled that I realized it was a dream, that I could actually change what was happening. So the most common people do in a lucid dream experience was will be try to fly. I was 13 years old, so my dream content reflected my emerging adolescence. So like, wait, I can look at a girl now, and that's what I did. But that really set me off on this path of like, what is happening inside our heads? So lucid dreaming is the ability to be aware of the dreams, a dream during the dream in of itself. And it may have therapeutic value in things like post-traumatic stress, but it can also be entertaining for some people. And there's a greater interest in lucid dreaming now, and there's actually more scientific literature behind it. It seems to be a hybrid state where you're still in sleep, but your brain function is working differently. So the prefrontal cortex has more awareness of what's happening than you typically do during a dream. During a typical dream, you are not questioning reality. You're accepting what's happening in front of you. But in a lucid dreaming state, you become aware and you start questioning the reality of the dream itself.
Well, I know our listeners are fascinated in dreaming, as am I, and hopefully we'll find a little time to talk a little bit more about it. But first, let's talk about sleep difficulties and sleep deficits. How common are they?
Extremely common. The Center for Disease Control has referred to sleep disorders as an epidemic terms. In fact, if you work with teenagers at all, any of you are interacting with teenagers, you should assume that they're sleep deprived. The estimate from the Center for Disease Control is that 75% of teenagers aren't getting enough sleep. In adults, it certainly gets compounded as we get older. The first signs of not getting enough sleep, one is waking up tired. You should never, ever wake up tired. Two, you're going to tend to be inattentive and grumpy. If you know anybody who wakes up grumpy and is inattentive, you know there's something wrong with their sleep.
Causes? I mean, did you actually say 75% of teenagers are not getting enough sleep?
That's the statistic from the Center for Disease Control. There's a publication called The Great Sleep Recession. And your listeners can find it. The Great Sleep Recession refers to the lack of sleep among teenagers, 75%. And lack of sleep makes people impulsive also.
So what causes all of this sleep deprivation, sleep deficit, sleep trouble, insomnia, whatever we call it? Why? Why are we having so much trouble sleeping?
Dr. Dement famously said that the biggest thing challenging sleep is ignorance. So what happens is people are not making sleep a priority in their lives. We may view sleep as an inconvenience, but also for teenagers specifically, biologically, they have a shift in their biological clock, what we call circadian rhythms, where they tend to go to bed later. It's not the internet. Other animals do something similar, where they shift their sleep to sleeping later. Just like as we get older, we tend to go to bed earlier. So the physiological reasons why teenagers are going to bed later, but school starts too early, and that sleep restricts them. So society is sleep restricting the teenagers, and society is also sleep restricting adults in general by us having to get up at certain times to go to work, to long commutes, and the other factors in it. So basically, it's not making sleep a priority in our lives. And we think of sleep as a cornerstone of health. It's an essential biological feature. It's as important as breathing or food.
It seems to me that if teenagers are falling asleep later for biological reasons, maybe the society should push the start of the school day back a little bit so it's not quite so early. Wouldn't that make sense?
That's correct. And California became the first state in the nation to pass a law to protect the sleep health of teenagers. And it goes into effect next year. So this is happening not just at the state level, but at a national, international level. There's greater awareness of the importance of sleep for teenagers. And what they found, the RAND Corporation actually analyzed this, that if we get the teenagers to start school later, there are billions of dollars in savings just on decreased car accidents. The most common cause of death among teenagers are car accidents and, sadly, suicidal behavior. And both of these things are impacted by not getting adequate amounts of sleep.
Dr. Pelayo, you suggest in your wonderful book, How to Sleep, that the old rules of sleep hygiene don't really work. Now, I can't tell you how grateful I am to hear about that, because we have heard from so many quote-unquote experts that the solution to insomnia is sleep hygiene. And then we hear from our listeners and our readers, that nonsense. So what are the old rules? And then what are your new ideas?
The term sleep hygiene is simply overly successful. So many people use the term that it's hard to know what people really mean by it anymore. It was popularized by Dr. Peter Harari at the Mayo Clinic. And the idea was that you would have just good habits for sleeping. But I don't think it's fair to tell a patient that they have poor hygiene, when it really is just habits. It's not an issue of hygiene, it's an issue of your habits. And habits can be changed. So it's a different way of thinking about this. The American Academy of Sleep Medicine guidelines specifically state that sleep hygiene in of itself has never helped anybody sleep better with chronic insomnia. Sleep hygiene is good tips for all of us in general. And they're usually things not to do. Don't read in bed. Don't watch TV in bed. However, people with insomnia are well beyond that. It's like telling somebody with anxiety, don't worry. It's not going to help. You can't tell somebody who's anxious simply to relax. It won't help them. So we know that we need to get beyond this. People who come to see us in the clinic, they've read all these sleep hygiene rules. They haven't memorized. They go back and forth on it. That's why your listeners will say, this doesn't work, because it doesn't work when you're at that level of poor sleep. So the better concept is based on what's called cognitive behavioral therapy. This is predicated on the concept that people behave a certain way based on life experiences, which make them think a certain way. And people with insomnia specifically are trapped in misconceptions about their sleep. So if we give you the right information, that'll help you think differently. That'll make you change your behavior, and it'll snowball in your favor. So typical insomniac has poor sleep for decades before they see us. But once you teach them the cognitive behavioral therapy techniques, about 2/3 of them or more will start sleeping better without medication in about 6 weeks.
Now, I have to tell you, one of the things that drives me a little crazy is that all of the experts now say, well, if you don't get enough sleep, it's really bad for you. It's bad for your heart. It's bad for your brain. It's bad, bad, bad. And so then somebody with insomnia, chronic insomnia, is like, they're starting to worry, I'm not going to get enough sleep. And so now they're anxious, and it's a self-fulfilling nightmare. Pardon that pun. Help us get out of that. So how do we not be anxious about not getting enough sleep?
The main thing is getting good quality sleep and being refreshed when you wake up in the morning. Insomnia is a symptom that becomes a syndrome exactly for the reasons you described, Joe. Just like pain, you can have pain symptoms and you can have a separate pain syndrome. Once you start to worry about sleep when you're awake and start to accommodate the insomnia patterns, then the insomnia becomes entrenched. You start worrying, if I don't get enough sleep, then I beat myself up. A feature of chronic insomniacs is that they beat themselves up. They blame themselves for their sleep problems, and it's not fair to them, because then they think if something is wrong, and not only they're not good at something, it's something they have to do every single night that they're not good at. And that creates anticipatory anxiety about sleeping. We want to reverse all that. And we can maybe talk that in the next segment, if there's time.
You're listening to Dr. Rafael Pelayo, clinical professor at Stanford University School of Medicine in the Division of Sleep Medicine. Dr. Pelayo is part of the Stanford Sleep Medicine Clinic. His new book is How to Sleep, the new science-based solutions for sleeping through the night.
After the break, we'll talk about how to break the cycle of anxiety about not being able to get to sleep.
We're most awake just before we go to sleep. How can we learn to wind down so we can close our eyes and drift off?
Some people wake up in the wee hours and can't get back to sleep. What does Dr. Pelayo recommend for that?
When one person has trouble sleeping, it can disrupt the whole family. What is family-focused sleep medicine?
Last but not least, do you snore? What does that mean, and what should you do about it?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy podcast is sponsored in part by Kaya Biotics. Kaya Biotics offers the first probiotics which are both certified organic and hypoallergenic.
All probiotics are produced in Germany under laboratory conditions with high-quality ingredients and under strict regulatory oversight.
The 3 available formulas are created for very specific purposes, such as strengthening the immune system, fighting yeast infections, and helping with weight loss.
To learn more about Kaya Biotics probiotics and the important topic of gut health, you can visit their website, KayaBiotics.com. That's Kaya Biotics.com. Use the discount code PEOPLE for $10 off your first purchase. Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Kaya Biotics, organic probiotic products made in Germany. KAYABiotics.com.
Also by CocoVia, now offering its cardio health product with 500 milligrams of cocoflavanols. More information at cocovia.com.
Many people have heard that insomnia can contribute to a number of serious health problems, including hypertension, diabetes, obesity, and cognitive impairment. Whenever they have trouble getting to sleep promptly, they worry that they're endangering their health. That leads to a vicious cycle because the worry keeps them awake, and being awake makes them worry even more. Is there any way to overcome this anxiety?
Our guest today is Dr. Rafael Pelayo. He's a clinical professor at Stanford University School of Medicine in the Division of Sleep Medicine, and he's been part of the Stanford Sleep Medicine Clinic since 1993. He served on advisory boards and in leadership positions for the National Center on Sleep Disorders Research at the NIH, the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, the National Sleep Foundation, and the California Sleep Society. Dr. Pelayo is the author of How to Sleep, the new science-based solutions for sleeping through the night.
Dr. Pelayo, I think it's really common for people to worry that they won't be able to get enough sleep, or if they're having any trouble falling asleep, to worry that they won't be able to fall asleep. What can they do about that?
Understand that the vast majority of people with sleep problems will get better. In fact, it's unusual for our patients not to improve. So if you've been struggling with your sleep in any capacity, seeing a board-certified sleep expert is what you want to do. Now, it's important to distinguish seeing the doctor from getting a sleep study. Sometimes people will just get a sleep study by itself, but that's not the right approach for chronic insomnia. You really want a consultation with the actual sleep physician who will perform a history and physical examination and deal more directly with the problem of sleep. Chronic insomnia is thought to be perpetuated in part by behaviors and ways of thinking that actually make the problem worse. The more logical you are, the more analytical you are in your approach to your sleep, the more likely you are to screw it up. Logic would be for us never to sleep at all. And people with insomnia will often talk about trying to sleep. Nobody else talks that way. Everybody else goes to sleep. Biologically, it's easier to force somebody to wake up than to force somebody to fall asleep. If I were to say to you on the count of 3, fall asleep, you can't do it. But if I say stay awake, it's easier to do. So if you find yourself struggling to fall asleep or to stay asleep and you're getting frustrated with it, then you know that now you have a psychological component to your sleep problem. What we do in cognitive behavioral therapy is try to drill down to the specific maladaptive thinking that's driving their insomnia. For example, logic is if I can't sleep, I should rest. What could be more reasonable than that? If I can't sleep, I should rest. Because you're equating sleeping and resting. But biologically, sleeping and resting are two different things. If we got up and did 100 jumping jacks, you might feel tired, but you're not going to feel sleepy. So sleepiness and tiredness may converge or diverge. So if somebody thinks that if I can't sleep, I should rest, I might as well stay here and rest, what they're going to do is spend more time in bed, and the sleep becomes more inefficient. You're spending more time in bed than you're actually sleeping, and that leads to further frustration and reinforces the problem. The correct approach is actually counterintuitive. We actually ask people to spend less time in bed. By spending less time in bed, your drive to sleep will increase and sleep will become more efficient, and you cut back on the frustration of not being able to sleep. And that's one of the tools that we'll use, is simply getting to the core issue of what's driving your poor sleep. People with insomnia sometimes want a time machine. They want to go back in time to how it all began. But what triggered the insomnia may have passed years ago. It's no longer relevant. What really matters is what's driving it. And it's that maladaptive thinking that approach, the misconceptions about sleep are the issue.
Now, in How to Sleep, you have written that we're most awake right before we go to sleep. Isn't that the problem? A lot of people have trouble winding down so they can actually relax and just drift off.
You have to start thinking about sleeping as something that you get to do, nothing that you have to do. Sleeping is not a chore. Having a safe and place to sleep is a privilege. Many people don't have safe places to sleep. So at the evening, we will have a surge of alertness. but it's about 2 hours before we fall asleep. We get this kind of second wind. And other animals do this too. It's for our safety. If sleeping is the most inherently dangerous thing we can do as animals, we should be most alert before we fall asleep. So what you really want to do is kind of tuck yourself in. And I'd like you to think a little bit about how a child goes to sleep. Our best sleepers are not babies. The idea of sleeping like a baby is a fallacy. Babies don't sleep that great. They sleep very deeply, but they don't sleep that great. Our best sleepers are 8 and 9-year-olds. And your sleep is a reflection of your life. Your life's reflected in your sleep. So we really want to sleep like 8 or 9-year-olds and go to bed in states of serenity. And that's what winding down really is about. It's a state of serenity. It's not like, darn it, I got 6.2 hours left and I must fall asleep quickly. And if I don't sleep, I'm going to have a bad day tomorrow. Do I take a sleeping pill now? Do I save it for later? Do I take half a pill now? Do I take a second pill? And then what if I run out of refills? And that litany in your head, you want to get rid of all that. And when you want to go to bed in a state of serenity, you should go to bed feeling safe, comfortable, and loved. That's what we want. And if you go to bed in that state, you'll fall asleep much, much better.
Now, Dr. Pelayo, a lot of people can fall asleep. And I have to admit, I'm very good at falling asleep. Just the way you described. I snuggle up to Terry and 2 minutes later, I'm gone. But I sometimes have to get up around 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning to go to the bathroom. And when I get back in bed, I'm wide awake, wired, and, thinking a million thoughts. Now, I've come up with a solution, but I'd love to hear yours. What I do is I put my earpiece in and I listen to some silly talk radio, and I'm usually asleep within 3 or 4 minutes. And then I think, wow, I left that thing in my ear all night. What an idiot. But what's your solution for those people who say, I fall asleep just fine, Dr. Pelayo. It's when I have to wake up at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning to go to the bathroom, and then I can't go back to sleep.
I hear that every day, actually. That's very common. The way sleep problems tend to begin, as far as insomnia, there's a whole world of other sleep disorders we haven't gotten to, of course. But insomnia often begins with trouble falling asleep in teenagers and young adults, parents, for example. They have trouble falling asleep. But over time, then it becomes problems staying asleep. And then they'll often say, I have no trouble falling asleep, I have trouble staying asleep. But if you ask these people, and I would ask you how you fall asleep, oftentimes people stay awake to the last second. To use the term, they crash. They read a book until it falls out of their hands, or listen to a podcast or something like this one. And what happens is they're staying awake to the last possible second, and then they crash because the drive for sleep is so powerful. But once they get the minimum amount of sleep they need, maybe 5 hours, you often hear the number 5 hours. After 5 hours, they pop awake and they can't get back to sleep because they're already satiated their basic biological sleep drive. If you go to bed in a state of feeling that things are unfinished, unresolved, let's say you're next to Terry and you guys are about to drift off to sleep, and you turn to her as you're snuggling up to her and say, honey, did you lock the front door and did you turn off the stove? And she says to you, I think so. What's going to happen? Only 2 things can happen at that. Three things can happen. You're gonna go check. You're gonna ask her to go check, or as you're about to check, she says, no, you worry too much. Stay here with me. You'll snuggle. You stay in bed. Eventually, you'll fall asleep because the biological drive for sleep must be met. You'll fall asleep. But after 3 or 4 hours, you're going to pop awake and go check the front door and go check the stove because you went to bed in a state of having unfinished, unresolved things in the back of your mind.
So how do we get rid of those unresolved things, whether it's, did I lock the front door, or what about that big project, that talk I have to give on Tuesday?
You have to pretty much allow yourself to know that your day is over and give your day closure. And that's what people don't do. They want to work until like they're a machine. They're going to work constantly, turn off the machine, and then turn it back on in the morning. And people often will say to me, my problem is I can't turn off my brain. The brain's not meant to be turned off. The brain is actually very alert, very vigilant when we're sleeping. If an animal is prone to being attacked while it's sleeping, it shouldn't surprise you that the brain also monitors your environment and protects you while you're sleeping. So you're not going to be able to turn off your brain that way. What you really want to do is, if you're a person who happens to wake up with racing thoughts, if you on any given day, you got 10 things to do and you got 8 of them done, you had a wonderful day. But the 2 that you forgot to do, you're going to remember when you're laying in bed, because that's the first time most people, the only time they're alone with their thoughts doing nothing, not driving, not exercising, not doing anything. When you're alone with your thoughts is when you're in bed. And that's when you're going to remember the things that you forgot to do. But now you're giving your body mixed signals. You're saying, I want to sleep, but I also want to remember something. So instead, you listen to a podcast or you read or something, and you, out of exhaustion, you crash. I say it's like leaving the car running at the pump at the gas station. Let the motor run. Eventually, the motor will drain the gas completely, and then you want to put in $2 worth of gas, drive fast to the next gas station. So to get rid of that, what really helps, if you're a person who tends to wake up with recurrent thoughts, racing thoughts, is journaling at night. Sitting down somewhere. If you have trouble with your sleep, typically even waking up in the middle of the night like you are, go to bed a little bit later, maybe 20 minutes, 30 minutes later. But take some time in the evening, after dinner, but before you get into bed, to be alone with your thoughts. And write down what you have to do tomorrow. We all have loose ends. I got to go to the store to buy milk. I got to go to the grocery store. I have to go to the dry cleaners, whatever. Put down those things down that you have to do, but also the bigger things. The loose ends. I never sent Uncle Joe a thank you note for birthday presents from 5 years ago. Write down, I want to send Uncle Joe a message. By writing this stuff down in the evening, away from the bedroom, writing it down in a journal, at the end of it, that's about 10 or 15 minutes. Tell yourself, whatever's left undone, I'll do it tomorrow. Say it and believe it. Now your day's organized for tomorrow. Now do something you enjoy. Don't just go straight to sleep. Relax. Now you get to go to sleep. Warm bath, spend time with your spouse, whatever it is that lets you know that my day's over. But you really want to give your day closure. This is what you're trying to do at night. Then when you pop awake in the middle of the night, remind yourself the important stuff already got written down, and it's okay. And you're going to go back to sleep. And if you do that, that's a good way of getting rid of those racing thoughts that are keeping people awake. You see, a principle is that what's waking you up, let's say they need to urinate at night, is different than what's keeping you awake. Some people wake up, go pee, and fall asleep immediately. Some people are awake for hours afterwards. So what wakes you up may not be what's keeping you awake. And you have to make that distinction when you're talking to your patients.
Dr. Pelayo, rather than focusing on a patient's sleep disorder specifically, you have developed an approach that looks at the lives of your patients. Would you tell us what family-focused sleep medicine is all about, please?
Sure. Actually, when Joe was talking about how he slept, in my mind, I was wondering how you slept. Because when one person doesn't sleep well, it affects the entire family. And one of the things that you encounter a lot is you only usually get one insomniac per couple. You'll have one person say to you, I can't sleep, but the person that they're next to, their significant other, is sleeping very soundly. If sleep is inherently dangerous, if I have a light sleeper next to me, that allows me to sleep very deeply. I don't have to worry about somebody breaking into the house because I have a light sleeper next to me. And the light sleeper knows that this person sleeps so deeply that if somebody breaks into the house, they're not going to hear it, so they're counting on me. So over the years, the light sleeper gets lighter and the deep sleeper gets deeper. And I think this begins with parenting. When you become first-time parents, and again, there's all kinds of families, all kinds of dynamics, and all kinds of interactions. So I'm speaking in general terms, obviously. But when a couple has a child, and the child, think about what we're dealing with. A baby has to be fed every 2 to 4 hours. How can we be 8-hour sleepers if we have to interrupt our sleep every 2 to 4 hours? Unless biologically, this idea of being able to interrupt our sleep is hardwired into our brains. So if the baby wakes up, the deep sleeper hears the baby crying, what will happen is the deep sleeper will pretend they're asleep. So check this. Check your partner. That's a guilty laughter if I've ever heard one.
No. Actually, it's not. I am the one who woke up when the kids started to cry. Although I sleep pretty well nowadays. I was the one who heard the children, and Joe might have been pretending to sleep.
Yeah, what happened is they hear the baby cry.
Definitely was not getting up.
Yeah, the deep sleeper, if they hear the baby cry, they open their eyes and slam them shut as fast as they can and pretend they're sleeping and wait for the other one to take care of it. So that's one way of thinking about this. But also the bigger issue with families is most sleep disorders are familial. If you snore, your kids have a tendency to snore. If your parents snore, you have a tendency to them to also have snoring and breathing issues. Most sleep disorders run in families. Restless legs syndrome is a strongly genetic condition. So it's unusual to find one member of the family sleeping poorly and not other people in the family having similar things. Sleep apnea, which I alluded to with snoring, has certain craniofacial features, which people inherit. So you always have to think about how everybody sleeps. Another part to this is when we deal with children, people often ask, well, when you talk with babies and little kids, people ask, well, how does this child sleep? It depends on how the parents slept before they had the baby. You can have a baby who sleeps, let's say, 7 hours a night, born to a mother, again, the mothers often take care of the children, but it can be any combination. But you have a baby sleep 7 hours a night, born to a parent who, before she was a parent, slept typically 6 hours a night. She sleeps 6 hours routinely. The baby sleeps 7. She'll tell all her friends her baby sleeps through the night what a wonderful baby she has, and by reflection, what a wonderful parent she happens to be. Take that same 7-hour sleeping baby born to a mom who liked to get 8 hours of sleep. She'll say, my baby wakes me up every night. Same 7-hour sleeping baby. So we got to get a sense of how parents slept before they were parents. And it's not just the amount of sleep, but let's say you have a parent who had bouts of insomnia before they were a parent. Now they're preconditioned to be worried about sleep interruptions. I feed the baby every 2 to 4 hours, but I can't get back to sleep myself. Or you have a parent, let's say it's the dad, who has subacute sleep apnea, snores a lot, has poor quality sleep, but has been getting by for years this way. When you add the normal interruptions of parenting, it becomes an issue.
Dr. Pelayo, you've mentioned snoring a couple of times. You say in your book that snoring is never normal. What causes snoring? What can we do about it?
Sure. It's easy to prove that snoring is not normal. Right now, the three of us are breathing, but you don't hear any of us snoring. Normally, breathing is silent. You don't make noise when you're breathing normally. Any noise you're making while you're breathing is a sign of obstruction because what you're hearing is turbulent airflow. Turbulence, just like you would on a plane. When you're in the wild, there's no snoring animals out in the wild. You hear snoring in domestic animals, old farm animals, old dogs may snore. But why would you tip off your presence to predators by making noise when your guard is down? It'd be like a dinner bell. So all snoring involves some degree of obstruction, and snoring is coming from our throats, the throat being the space from your Adam's apple, your larynx, to the back of your nose. So you can feel it with your own hand where that space is. It's the chamber where food and oxygen mixes. Below that point, the food and oxygen go in different directions. They get redirected. But there's an inherent vulnerability to the throat. If you think about what you use your throat for, use your throat for eating, breathing, talking, laughing, singing. It's a complicated structure. You need a rigid pipe to sustain the negative force of the lung sucking in the air. You need a collapsible tube to get the food down, and a very exquisite instrument to this kind of thing. So snoring is always some degree of airflow obstruction.
You're listening to Dr. Rafael Pelayo, clinical professor at Stanford University School of Medicine in the Division of Sleep Medicine. Dr. Pelayo is part of the Stanford Sleep Medicine Clinic and has served on advisory boards and in leadership positions for the National Center on Sleep Disorders Research at the NIH, the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, the National Sleep Foundation, and the California Sleep Society. His new book is How to Sleep: The New Science-Based Solutions for Sleeping Through the Night.
After the break, Dr. Pelayo describes what we can do about obstructive sleep apnea.
This condition is often treated with a CPAP machine, short for continuous positive airway pressure. What are the pros and cons of these devices?
Just how much sleep do we really need? Can we get by with less?
You'll also learn how our daytime activities, like eating, drinking, and interacting with screens, can affect our sleep once we're in bed.
How about naps? Are they good or bad?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy podcast is supported in part by CocoVia, now offering its new cardio health product with 500 milligrams of cocoa flavanols. This 100% pure Cocoa Pro cocoa extract formulation is backed by 20-plus years of research on cocoa flavanols.
Cocoa flavanols increase the body's output of nitric oxide to improve endothelial function, which results in enhanced blood vessel flexibility and better blood flow. More information at cocovia.com. Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by CocoVia, now offering its cardio health product with 500 milligrams of cocoa flavanols. More information at cocovia.com.
And by Kaya Biotics, organic probiotic products made in Germany. KAYA biotics.com.
Do you snore? If so, don't ignore it. One of the possible causes of snoring is called obstructive sleep apnea. What is that, and how can it be treated? The most common treatment is a device called a CPAP machine. Is there a way to make it easier to use and more effective? How do our daytime activities, like meals, screen time, and naps, affect the ease with which we fall asleep? Are sleeping pills helpful? Or are there better ways to get a good night's sleep?
We're talking with Dr. Rafael Pelayo. He's a clinical professor at Stanford University School of Medicine in the Division of Sleep Medicine and has been a part of the Stanford Sleep Medicine Clinic since 1993. Dr. Pelayo is the author of the new book, How to Sleep, the new science-based solutions for sleeping through the night.
Dr. Pelayo, we've just been talking about snoring. One of the things that might be behind snoring is something called obstructive sleep apnea. What is it and what do we do about it?
Obstructive sleep apnea is a condition where the brain prefers to sleep than to breathe. Think about it. Sleeping is so important that the brain says, I'd rather sleep than breathe. And it's as we're sleeping, there's a narrowing in the throat, a relaxation. Your lungs are the same size. You're trying to get the same volume of air to a smaller space. The chest exerts so much negative force, it actually implodes the airway and blocks off the breathing. And you're actually choking, and your oxygen can dip down, and it also makes your sleep very fragmented. So obstructive sleep apnea is a condition where people have trouble breathing and sleeping at the same time. The way to counter it is by keeping the throat more open. So we try to make the throat stay in the same position when you're awake than when you're sleeping. The biggest thing in our throats is our tongues. Think about that space I talked about earlier. The biggest thing taking up space in there is going to be the tongue. So when people sleep on their backs, the tongue slides backwards and can block the breathing. So sleeping on your side may alleviate some of the snoring sound and also alleviate some of the obstruction. That's if the blockage is from your tongue, but the blockage can also be occurring at the nose or further down, a little bit further down below the tongue. So it depends where the blockage is. We can accumulate too much fat in our throats, and that also why weight is a factor. But many of our patients are thin. You don't have to be an overweight middle-aged man to have sleep apnea. We see a lot of thin people with sleep apnea, a lot of young, thin people with sleep apnea because of their anatomy and the tongue sliding backwards. So one is positional treatments for it. The most common treatment is a device called a CPAP. That stands for continuous positive airway pressure. And this was discovered in 1981. The original machine was a vacuum cleaner. And if you reverse the motor, you can actually have the air blow out, right? The opposite end of the vacuum cleaner. So you can blow air through somebody's nose and open up the throat. And when you do that, you reverse the sleep apnea and people sleep better. If any of you have ever been prescribed a CPAP machine, the first sign that it's working correctly is that your snoring is eliminated completely. If you snore even a little bit on CPAP, it's not set correctly. It should be 0. Nobody should snore at all if they have a CPAP machine while they're sleeping.
Now, Dr. Pelayo, a lot of people say, yeah, my sleep doctor recommended a CPAP machine, but makes so much noise. It's so big. I have to clean it. It's such a chore. I only used it for 6 weeks and then I gave up on it. And there's also something about a recall. So give us the latest and greatest information on CPAP machines and how you overcome resistance from patients who go too much trouble.
CPAP has never been better. The current CPAP machines are small, designed for traveling, and are quiet. Certainly a lot less noise than anybody snoring. So all these issues with the sleep, the mask being uncomfortable, all that has changed. If you've not tried CPAP in the last 2 years, you owe it to yourself to give it another try. The technology is improving all the time. For some time now, when I give lectures and I speak to people, I tell people we're living in the golden era of CPAP. In the future, we'll probably stop using it. There'll be some new technologies that are emerged. But right now, it's never been better up until just recently. Just this summer, one of the main manufacturers announced a national recall of their machines. There was a foam inside the machine to make less noise. That foam has been degraded, and some particles have been released, and it's also given off some gases. So the FDA has advised on the recall. It's a voluntary recall. The company is Philips Respironics. If any of the listeners are having a Philips Respironics device, contact the place you bought it from. Philips Respironics wants you to register your machine so they can repair the device. But that's a national recall that's happening. It's only for that one manufacturer, not for the rival company, ResMed. But Philips Respironics has large market share. So what's happening currently is we have a national shortage of CPAP machines because they're recalling some devices and the manufacturer has not yet been able to ramp up production to meet the demand. Having said that, you owe it to yourself to try CPAP again. It really works better than ever. The machines are now mini computers, so they'll adjust the pressure breath by breath. They have humidifiers built into them, and they have filters in them. So you're going to be breathing warm, moist, clean air. And the machines and the masks have now been engineered also to make it more comfortable for the bed partner to sleep better. Old CPAP machines would actually disrupt the bed partner sleep. That's also been improved on. So it's a great time to try CPAP.
Dr. Pelayo, how much sleep does a person need? And can they get by with less?
You can always get by with less sleep. People often give you two numbers when you ask them about their sleep needs. They say things like, I can get by with 6, but I'd like to get 8. So people will get by with little sleep as possible. But when you're getting by with little sleep as possible, if something interrupts your sleep, you really don't have any reserves. Ideally, you want to get between 7.5 to 9 hours of sleep a night. That's what we're striving for most folks.
Dr. Pelayo, how do our activities in our waking hours affect our sleep? Does food, drink, exercise, electronic devices, does any of that have an impact after we get into bed?
Yes, of course. One of the things I mentioned before, and it's true, maybe repeating that your sleep is a reflection of your life's reflected in your sleep. So alcohol, for example, close to bedtime, relaxes the throat muscles and will make you snore louder. So you want to avoid alcohol close to bedtime. Food, people say things like eating pepperoni pizza gives me nightmares. Well, is it really the pepperoni pizza, or is the fact that you have food in your stomach, and when you're trying to breathe through a narrowing, the diaphragm pushes down on the stomach and forces the food to come up, and you have heartburn or indigestion, and that's really the issue: is the indigestion that's causing you to disrupt your sleep. And when you have a dream, if anything interrupts that dream, you'll become aware of it, and that's why people may report nightmares. Exercise too close to bedtime can make it hard to fall asleep, but evening exercise can be helpful. In particular, afternoon exercise seems to be the ideal time to do it. So pretty much most activities that people have, they'll experiment a little bit with themselves how they do it. Things that really seem to be helpful are like mindfulness techniques, relaxation techniques, meditation can help you fall asleep better if you tend to have trouble falling asleep. But it's a personal thing. You'll have people who say things like they can fall asleep anywhere, anytime. Well, that just means you're really sleep deprived. You should not really be able to fall asleep anywhere, anytime. That's what's happening there. So it depends on the individual concern that somebody has. But yes, most of these activities will interrupt sleep or interfere with the sleep to some degree. As far as electronics, we often beat up the teenagers and the young adults because they have electronics and the light is coming into their eyes. And yes, it's true that blue light will interfere with the secretion of melatonin, which is the hormone that tells the brain that's approaching. But it's not just the light source, it's the content. It seems to be a bigger deal. So it's not just that it's the blue light, it's also the content. I remember as a teenager staying awake because I was reading a good book. Just the content of itself can make you stay awake. So that may be part of it too.
Well, I appreciate the fact that you're not interested in beating up the teenagers. I think that's a bad thing to do anyway. I do want to ask you about naps. Whether you're a teenager or an oldster, you might be tempted to take a nap in the afternoon. So what's the story on naps? You've compared them in your book, How to Sleep, to snacks. And a lot of people eat snacks. A lot of people take naps. Is it good, bad, or indifferent?
So, yes, napping is like snacking. It depends on the circumstances. If you're somebody who is going to have anticipating a big meal, you're going to go to a feast, you may want to avoid eating before you go there because you want to be able to enjoy that meal. But at the same time, you want to visit somebody who you don't trust the food at their house. You don't want to go there hungry. So it may make sense to have a snack before you go to that person's house. Same thing with sleeping. You can only fall asleep during a nap if you're sleep deprived enough to fall asleep. Children who sleep well at night, children, 7, 8-year-old people tend to be sleep satiated. They can't take a nap. They get very frustrated if you tell an 8-year-old to go take a nap. They get angry. So if you are sleep deprived, napping makes sense. If you're somebody who has trouble falling asleep or staying asleep at night, then napping may actually be a hindrance. It's a safety thing. So let's say you are a shift worker or a first responder. It makes sense to catch a nap when you have a break because those jobs tend to have sleep deprivation as part of them. But again, if you're somebody who struggles with their sleep at night and say, well, I might as well get my sleep now, then that could be a problem. Also with nap, what's the difference between a snack and a meal? What's the difference between a sleep bout and a nap? It's the amount. So usually a nap that's less than 40 minutes is what you're shooting for. If a nap is much longer than that, you can actually wake up feeling worse or feeling groggier. That's called sleep inertia.
Dr. Pillai, I'll tell you what happens to me. If I fall asleep, like a little nap, maybe around 8 or 9 o'clock in the evening, I have a hard time falling asleep an hour or two later. It's like, oh, I got that nap. Now my body has somehow reset its clock and it's not interested in falling asleep. So I have to be pretty careful to avoid late naps.
Right. Joe, what's happening is you're not getting enough sleep. So then the homeostatic drive for sleep is kicking in at 8 or 9 o'clock and you're falling asleep because the biological drive for sleep is so strong. But then after that nap, you satisfy that drive a little bit. But now the second wind at night, the circadian, it's called clock-dependent alerting. That's an actual term you can look up, clock-dependent alerting, and that's what's keeping you awake later. So when we talk about napping, we actually think about them as more of an early afternoon event, not a pre-sleep, which is what you're kind of doing now. And that may also explain why there's sometimes trouble going back to sleep later. So yeah, the napping should go on much, much earlier in the day, not close to bedtime.
Now, Dr. Pelayo, there is a huge industry in sleeping pills. All you have to do is walk into any pharmacy in the country and you will find the PM nighttime sleep aids. And they are usually in pain relievers. So there's Tylenol PM, and there's Aleve PM, and there's Advil PM, and the list just goes on. And they all contain diphenhydramine, which is an antihistamine, which is an anticholinergic drug, which could affect memory, blah, blah, blah. I won't go into the details. But in addition to the diphenhydramine in the OTCs, we've got all of these prescription sleeping pills. Remember the Lunesta Lunamoth, and then there's Ambien, and there's Sonata. They have all these names that sound so sleepy-inducing. Oh, isn't that Sonata perfect? So I'd just like to get your overview on sleeping pills because I know that tens of millions of people depend on them just in case they might have trouble falling asleep.
So I think of sleeping pills as just tools. They're just tools for us. It helps a person fall asleep or stay asleep. I believe that from dating back to antiquity, the earliest medications ever used were either sleeping potions or love potions, and often they were the same thing. So this goes far back. Historically, sleeping pills have gotten safer, not stronger. We had stronger medications for sleep in the 50s and 60s when we were prescribing barbiturates and quaaludes. So sleeping pills have gotten safer, not stronger. But the real thing to think about is why they have trouble sleeping in the first place. If I have the flu and I'm not going to go to work tomorrow, then taking something that is sedating and will take care of my flu symptoms, keep me in bed, may be a good thing for me to do. But the problem is if you're relying on these medications to sleep. So if somebody says to me, I can't sleep without X or Y medication or over-the-counter product, then that's the problem. Because of course you can sleep without them. You can, of course, sleep without them, but you may struggle to sleep without them because you haven't learned how to sleep properly. There are lots and lots of sleeping pills out there. Just some relatively new ones were just released. And the focus from the FDA has been on the safety of these medications, not the efficacy of them. So as I said, they've gotten safer, but there's still going to be an issue. The problem most physicians have when prescribing medication for sleep is if I start prescribing, when do I stop? If you never address the underlying reason somebody has insomnia, and all you do is offer them a medication to sedate them, it's not surprising that eventually the medication may stop working because the root cause of the insomnia never got addressed. On the other hand, if you're saying, listen, I'm going to start you on a kind of behavioral therapy program to get you to learn how to sleep better, But until you start that program, the program may not be available for a few weeks. It's not the right time for you, or you're traveling or something. Then I can use medication as a bridge until we can get you to that place. That's a different way of using it. So again, I think of the medications as tools for the circumstances that we're trying to correct.
Dr. Pelayo, we're hoping that all of our listeners will read your great book, How to Sleep. Beyond that, we're going to ask you for your closing advice for how we can address and correct sleep problems.
There's no reason anybody should be sleeping poorly. There is really, really good resources now. The American Academy of Sleep Medicine has a webpage called sleepeducation.org where you can find accredited sleep doctors. The National Sleep Foundation also has good resources for you. Modern sleep medicine have reached a point that pretty much any sleep complaint that somebody has should be able to be improved upon. My job as a doctor is fun. Most of my patients get better. But they often say the same thing. They've had poor sleep for years and years and years. So that doesn't have to be the case anymore. So thank you so much for your time.
Dr. Rafael Pelayo, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
Thank you for having me.
You have been listening to Dr. Rafael Pelayo, clinical professor at Stanford University School of Medicine in the Division of Sleep Medicine. Dr. Pelayo is part of the Stanford Sleep Medicine Clinic and has served on advisory boards and in leadership positions for the National Center on Sleep Disorders Research at the NIH, the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, the National Sleep Foundation, and the California Sleep Society. Dr. Pelayo is the author of How to Sleep, the new science-based solutions for sleeping through the night.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wodarski engineered. Dave Graydon edits our interviews. B.J. Liederman composed our theme music.
The People's Pharmacy is a co-production of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC, with the People's Pharmacy.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Kaya Biotics, organic probiotic products made in Germany. KAYABiotics.com.
Also by CocoVia, now offering its cardio health product with 500 milligrams of cocoflavanols. More information at cocovia.com.
Also by Verizana, an analytical laboratory providing home health tests for hormones, gut health, and the microbiome, now with an annual health club plan. Online at verisana.com.
Today's show is number 1268. You can find the podcast on our website, peoplespharmacy.com.
When you go to peoplespharmacy.com, you can share your thoughts about today's show in the comments section of Show 1268.
If you found our conversation with Dr. Pelayo helpful, you'll be very interested in the podcast. That's because he discusses the difference between pink, brown, and white noise machines. How do dogs help us sleep? And what is narcolepsy? You might be surprised to learn that a lot of people who keep falling asleep during the day could have this serious sleep disorder. Finally, why do we dream? It's all in the podcast.
You can subscribe to our podcast through your favorite podcast provider. We post the show on our website on Monday morning. You might want to share it with a friend or family member.
At our website, you can sign up for our free online newsletter to get the latest news about COVID-19 and other important health stories. By subscribing to our newsletter, you'll also have regular access to our weekly podcast and find out ahead of time which topics we'll be covering. In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thank you for listening. Please join us again next week. Thank you for listening to the People's Pharmacy Podcast. It's an honor and a pleasure to bring you our award-winning program week in and week out. But producing and distributing this show as a free podcast takes time and costs money.
If you like what we do and you'd like to help us continue to produce high-quality, independent healthcare journalism, please consider chipping in.
All you have to do is go to peoplespharmacy.com/donate.
Whether it's just one time or a monthly donation, you can be part of the team that makes this show possible. Thank you for your continued loyalty and support. We couldn't make our show without you.